It's a pleasure to be here and to welcome you all. I won't repeat what John Borelli already stated about how we behave properly, but I would call to your attention this magnificent room with all of its inspiring texts and its beautiful symbolic images, but you'll notice that it is crowned by one word along the back there, wisdom. It's not what we profess, it's what we promote, it's what we aspire to, it's what Georgetown is about seeking and what this conference is about. And you'll also note that wisdom has 6 letters, like the 6 days of creation. It's an ongoing process. We haven't gotten to the sabbatical 7th yet. When we think we have, we're in trouble. So to start us in our thinking, aspiring toward wisdom, going in alphabetical order, more or less, is Dr. John Borelli, about whom you have heard us a number of times. So I will just mention in the context of Nostra Aetate that he's written a great deal about it and served over 16 years in the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in ecumenical and interreligious affairs. John, the floor is yours. From your seat or here, whichever you prefer.
I think I'll stay here because we're going to have a discussion mainly, but we've been asked to do opening statements. So let me get mine over with, all right? 3 80-year-old men put the project on the agenda. Pope John XXIII, who called a council to the surprise of all but a handful, French historian and Shoah survivor Jules Isaac, received in private audience by Pope John at precisely the right time for the idea to pop into the Pope's consciousness, and Cardinal Augustin Bea, who maneuvered it through the council. And when Cardinal Bea presented the first draft to the council in November 1963, he was the only one of the 3 still alive. That's how fragile its origin was, but it didn't stop there. The project faced several threats. Cautious bishops, some with leverage to disrupt, worried about too much change and political implications. At Vatican II, some wanted Muslim relations included, some of these for other than political reasons. Bishops and advisors from Asia and Africa, where few Jews lived, were unenthusiastic. But Paul VI, who succeeded Pope John, responded to their request and established a Vatican office for the followers of the traditions in their worlds. Regarding Jews, Nostra Aetate reminded Christians that Jesus, his mother, the apostles, the early disciples were Jews, and that Jews and Christians have spiritual bonds for exploration through joint studies and dialogue. Nostra Aetate insisted that Jews today and generally at the time of Jesus were not guilty for his death, and that God holds dear the Jewish people, not regretting any gifts and covenants. Nostra Aetate condemned anti-Semitism and insisted that Jews are not a rejected or accursed people. All this in 422 Latin words in section 4 of an expanded final document that also spoke of the one human family, the universal religious sense, and respect for and dialogue with those experiencing various manifestations of that religious sense, notably Muslims, and rejecting all forms of persecution and discrimination, quote, against men and women because of their race, color, condition in life, or religion. Bishops from the Middle East, where religion and politics are tightly wound, presented the last major challenge. They were perhaps more aware of the long tradition of anti-Jewish church teachings and prayers than most, but worried about reactions from Muslims interpreting this as approval of the state of Israel. Paul VI feared they would walk out. Some of them presented wording, and it was approved. A bishop on Bea's secretariat from Germany pleaded with it to move towards the final vote because Europe was only beginning to face the recent past. The words Israel and Holocaust are not in the text, though Bea had reminded the council of the terrible crimes against Jews under fascism and the Shoah, and this was clearly on the minds of the majority of bishops. So on October 28, 1965, 2,221 of them approved Nostra Aetate in a final vote with only 88 no votes. Seemingly obvious and naive to us 60 years later, Had the document claimed more than beyond its carefully chosen 1,140 Latin words, it might have met with more resistance than it did. Some of what was left out disappointed many and still disappoint many today, but Nostra Aetate was a constitution, not a comprehensive report. Approval speeded past bogged-down discussions of missionary activity. Only the word dialogue was added without integration of the concept to the decree on missionary activity. Thus, the relationship between mission and dialogue would be argued for the next 50 years. Even the absurd question, is there a mission to Jews? Debate dissipated when Pope Francis reiterated Nostra Aetate's message as accompaniment and encounter, but damage was done. Theological progress among scholars and interreligious dialogue more often takes place outside of official church dialogues. That's the opposite of what ecumenical dialogue happens in it then. The formation of the International Jewish Committee on Interreligious Consultations was really probably the first big step forward. There are a lot of steps on local levels, but on the global level. Paul VI created commissions for religious relations with Judaism, religious relations with Muslims in 1974, and the former immediately issued guidelines for dialogue. Other publications followed: Notes on Preaching, Catechesis, 1985, Reflections on the Shoah, 1998, and The Gifts and Calling of God Are Irrevocable, 2015. Other milestones included these: when the Synagogue of Rome welcomed Pope John Paul II on April 13, 1986. Pope John Paul II also spoke in a courtyard of the great Umayyad Mosque in Damascus in 2001, and Pope Benedict prayed in the Blue Mosque in Istanbul in 2006. The first World Day of Prayer for Peace in Assisi in October 1986, hosted by John Paul II, represented the most visible implementation of Nostra Aetate to date, 21 years after the final vote. A year earlier in Morocco, he had told tens of thousands of young Muslims that we worship the same God. Other milestones came in 1993 with the fundamental agreement between the Holy See and the State of Israel, bringing diplomatic recognition, and something similar, recognizing the Kingdom of Jordan and establishing a liaison with the Palestinian people. Papal visits followed to Israel: John Paul II in 2000, Benedict XVI in 2009, and Francis in 2014. Finally, the Pontifical Biblical Commission's releasing its study, The Jewish People and Their Sacred Scriptures in the Christian Bible, 2002, was a big step, supplying, among other insights, what Vatican II did not do: incorporation of the Jewish understanding of covenant in the Constitution on Divine Revelation. Much else happened. Much remains to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'm going to turn to Professor Adam Gregerman next, who is Professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies and co-director of the Institute for Catholic-Jewish Relations, or Jewish-Catholic Relations, at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. He serves as chair of the Council of Centers on Jewish-Christian Relations and is also on the board of the National Council of Synagogues and the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations. Adam?
Thanks. First, let me say thank you to John, to Noam, and to many others who were involved in organizing this conference. I appreciate the invitation to join you. To appreciate the reception of Nostra Aetate, which is sort of the second substantive term in the title of this session, I think it's helpful to go back to the start. That is, if you had asked a knowledgeable Jew in 1966 what he or she thought about the document, I suspect that the response would have been mixed at best. When it was released, the response was not especially positive. And I mention this now because when I think back about the last few anniversaries that I have gone to, most recently 2015, but even before that, I was involved in some celebrations of the issuance of Nostra Aetate. There is a kind of almost universal sense of appreciation among Catholic and Jewish participants, Jewish attendees alike. And I think that it's helpful to go back to the start, let's say going back to the issuance of the document, in order to appreciate, which I hope we have a chance to do in this discussion, to appreciate what it is that brought us from this mixed Jewish response, or even in some cases negative Jewish response to the document, up to the present, up to the widely positive response that the document has received. Let me mention a few of the topics, and John has already alluded to some of them. I suspect there will be some overlap here. I mean, the document's only 14 lines long, so I'm going to do the best we can to say something new. But I want to mention just briefly the topic of the word deicide. There had been discussion about including that word in the document, and yet it was, in the end, not included, and a source of some disappointment to Jews who had wanted to see the word included, or some more specific recognition of what it was that was at stake in the changes that were initiated with the document. I'll note, however, and I think this is probably true across the board for Protestant and Catholic churches in the wake of Nostra Aetate and Protestant documents from this time, that many of them address the topic of Jewish responsibility for the death of Christ in these early documents, and then you might even say logically, the topic just disappears, right? It's so obviously illogical on its face that it is significant, of course, that Nostra Aetate rejects that accusation, but it doesn't continue to be something that Jews and Catholics or Jews and Christians even talk about anymore afterwards, thankfully. Let me mention as well the topic of the Shoah, which there's nothing, of course, explicit about the Shoah mentioned in Nostra Aetate. The document decries hostility to all men and all Jews. It's against anti-Semitism, it's against persecution. But you would know nothing about what it was that prompted the issuance of that document. Now, I don't want to say it's simply the Shoah alone, but there are other changes happening in the Catholic Church and Western society that contributed to that document. But specifically the section on Jews and Judaism, the occurrence of the Shoah is of enormous import in leading up to its creation. The third topic I want to mention is living or later Judaism, by which I mean Judaism after Jesus, Judaism after the creation of Christianity. The document says little to nothing about the vitality of Judaism after the biblical period. That is, it largely emphasizes the rootedness of Christianity, the rootedness of the earliest believers in the Old Testament, the biblical tradition, but it doesn't say much beyond that. It also includes language about reconciling Jews and Christians together, sort of an allusion to a verse in the book of Ephesians, which, like other places in this document, is somewhat murky, but I think would make a Jewish reader uncomfortable in the hint of some type of erasure of Judaism or the subsuming of Judaism into something else. I'll sort of leave it at that because it says very little, but it's an idea that I think is problematic. Famously as well, the document has nothing on Israel, which its existence, its creation would have been extremely important to many Jews. The writers didn't just ignore the topic of Israel, but actively registered their resistance to anything that looked political. Right? The language was not for any political consideration do we undertake this document. And like all the other topics, there's discussion and development about these topics, Israel perhaps the least so. Finally, on the topic of mission, the document basically punts on the topic of mission. That is, it has a murky line about Jews and Christians standing side by side, speaking to the Lord or praying to the Lord or something like that, with reference to a verse in Zechariah. In the background was disagreement about whether there should be an explicit expression of hope for Jewish conversion. This document appears to kind of split the difference in a way that I suspect made no one happy. And a Jewish reader probably would have thought that does, at the very least, carve out the possibility of mission to the Jews. My purpose here isn't to be critical. In fact, I want to say the opposite, which is that I want to open the discussion by saying again where it is we started and where it is we are, and to think about what it is the church has done in those succeeding decades to deepen reflection on these issues in a way that showed that Nostra Aetate was actually a very important salutary starting point for a much richer discussion that moves forward on many of these issues. So I look forward to discussing those, that reception of the document. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will turn third to Professor Robin Young, Professor Darling Young, who is Ordinary Professor of the History of Christianity Emerita and Acting Editor of the Catholic Historical Review. She has taught at the Catholic University of America, that's across town for some of you who are not aware of that, at the University of Notre Dame, not Notre Dame, but Notre Dame, correct? And correct. Wesley Theological Seminary.
Notre Dame.
Notre Dame. She did not coach football there, however.
Far from.
Or they might have won that game the other day. And Wesley Theological Seminary, concentrating on the history of early Christianity, primarily in the Greek, Armenian, and Syriac-speaking region. And she was recently also chief editor and translator of Evagrius of Pontus, the Gnostic trilogy, and is completing a new translation of Origen's Contra Celsum. I look forward to that. She is member of the Vatican's International Theological Commission and in official dialogue with Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Oriental Orthodox, Roman Catholic official dialogues.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, because I teach early Christianity, I'm going to avoid the murky first century. But I am going to go back to the time period in which I feel comfortable, or at least I'm somewhat familiar. What I say also will reflect long years of working with an as yet unfinished translation of Second Esdras for Ezra, one of the very important books of the first century, standing, if you like, on a line no longer existing, a very Jewish work adopted into Christianity, and occupying an ambiguous position. But I want to begin 20 years ago instead of 2,000 years ago, almost, with an encounter with Daniel Boyarin. He taught at Hebrew U. If you've all watched the movie The Footnote, you will have heard a footnote about him in that movie, and then went to Berkeley. He came and gave a talk at Catholic U, which was very lively. He claimed that Christians and Jews didn't part ways until the rise of bishops and rabbis in the 4th and 5th century. Now, I was startled at that at the time, and I rebutted it, or attempted to. It's not easy with Daniel Boyarin. But have come to see the usefulness of his thesis. Unless Jews and Christians were still close to each other, very close, and I'm not talking about bishops and rabbis, with all due respect to both offices, unless they were still close to each other in the late 4th century, why would the notorious John Chrysostom and the even more notorious but less well-known Ephraim the Syrian rail against their congregations for attending Shabbos, for making contracts before rabbis, for using Jewish charms, etc.? And well, we know the answer is competition, but the important point is the connection. And why, on the other hand, would the Bibli repeat the scandalous tales of Jesus' conception and birth? The obvious answer is that leaders in each, writers in each, wanted to discredit the very attractive, not quite other. And Judaism, as does Christianity, remains the not quite other, the alienated sibling, not recognizable as long as distance is maintained, as it would be tragically after. I'm not going to blame Constantine, I'm going to blame Justinian. As long as distance is maintained, but immediately recognizable when that distance begins to be removed, as happened in the mid and later 20th century. One of the best examples of this tense mutual recognition is Justin's dialogue with Trypho, a Rabbi Tarfon, early 2nd century, in a close-fought interpretation of Scripture. Even better, and here I have to bring in Origen. Usually Augustine is thought of as being a kind of friend, but Origen is much more interesting. In his commentary on the Song of Songs, Origen, a teacher of the 3rd century and arguably the foundation of Christian thought, cites rabbinic practice with deep approval regarding that scriptural text, how it should be hidden from the young, here we mean young men, and he adopts rabbinic interpretation. Even more so in the Contra Celsum, over which I labor every morning, the debate with a pagan who argues against Christianity in the persona of an invented Jew. Origen debunks both the insulting persona and the representation of Jewish teaching, which is false, that is, Celsus's representation of it, advertising the archaic wisdom of Moses in the famous and well-known sentence, Plato read Moses, which is how he got his wisdom, and adopting the teachings, that is, Origen did, not the first one, adopting the teachings of Philo of Alexandria and occasionally of Josephus. Judaism was the beginning of philosophy and therefore the beginning of thought. What was lost when Hebrew was no longer known among Christians, with the exception of the rather grouchy biblical scholar Jerome, and Greek was abandoned among Jews? What was lost was developing interpretation and meaning of the Torah/Christian Old Testament and continuing discussion in a mutual language not regained until the 20th century. Well, what remained was perhaps some remembered commonalities. I was speaking at lunch today with someone about my experience with Chaldean Christians in Detroit who didn't realize that they sit Shiva too for their dead because they grew up so close to Jewish communities in the north of Iraq. But a better example, perhaps, is the devotion, again, not at a very high level of episcopal or rabbinic discourse, but at a very popular level, the devotion to Mort Shimoni among Syriac-speaking Christians. Who is she? She is well known from 2nd Maccabees, where she is not named, as a heroic woman who defied a Greek king or emperor's attacks on Kashrut and encouraged her 7 sons to do the same, ending in their deaths and the creation of the first, ironically, Christian martyrs. She is celebrated as a saint to the present in what is left of Christian Iraq as an example of resistance to militant and persecuting Islam. Not that every Islamic expression is, but that's their experience. What does Mort Shimoni mean? It means the lady, i.e. the saint of the Hasmoneans, that is, the Jewish royal and priestly dynasty of 140 BCE to 37 BCE, after leading the Maccabean revolt in Judea against the Seleucid Empire. That saint is remembered to this day in certain remaining congregations of Iraq and is a good example of what remains shared but half remembered. A person in my position would encourage everybody to go back with the insight of Boyarin in mind, to go back and look behind what the authorities of 4th and 5th century Judaism and Christianity, now hardening against each other, were not able to control, which was still, among some in the 4th and 5th century, a shared inheritance, extremely complex, and aware, with origin, of a Greek common tongue, but of Hebrew as the first and divine language. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very well done.
Last but certainly not least, Rabbi Dr. Judy Schindler, who is the Sklit Professor of Jewish Studies at Queen's University of Charlotte, North Carolina, and the founding director of the Stan Green Spoon Holocaust and Social Justice Education Center at Queen's University from 2016 to 2024. She holds a DHL from Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati with a dissertation on pioneering documents of interfaith dialogue, Christian and Jewish milestones in reaching out to the religious other. And she currently serves as a member of the Board of Governors of the International Jewish Committee on Interreligious Consultation. Please.
It's an honor to be here, and I'm very humbled to be here. So shortly after the announcement of Vatican II, Claire Hutchett Bishop, a close collaborator of Jules Isaac, approached the American Jewish Committee, the AJC, urging them to advocate for a public repudiation at the highest level of the church of the centuries-old Christian tradition that degraded Jews, charged them with heinous crimes, and valued them only as potential converts. Ecumenical councils were rare, she noted. This was an historic opportunity. Seize it, she said, and seize it they did. Built on advocacy both within and outside the church, Nostra Aetate was born. Nostra Aetate marked a theological turning point in Catholicism. For the first time, the church opened the doors to interreligious dialogue, recognizing the validity of other religions, that each religion can hold its own ray of truth. The journey that began with Jules Isaac's 1960 audience with Pope John XXIII, petitioning for a change in Christian teachings that had historically incited contempt for Jews, and that ended with the 1965 promulgation of Nostra Aetate, that journey was long and difficult. It shows that with vision and perseverance, even entrenched theological positions could be reformed. My doctoral research, in part, explored the dual narrative, Jewish and Catholic, that brought Nostra Aetate to life. Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum, the AJC's Interreligious Affairs Director, was central to this effort. His extensive records held at Cincinnati's American Jewish Archives captures the strategic Jewish advocacy that shaped what was then referred to as the Jewish Declaration, repudiating the long-standing lethal charge of collective Jewish guilt for Jesus' crucifixion. While Nostra Aetate is often seen as a singular moment, it was preceded by other important milestones in religious reconciliation. In 1945, the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt, issued by the German Protestant confessing church leaders who survived, acknowledged the church's silence during the Nazi era. Though glaring in its omissions, the The Stuttgart Declaration taught the power of confession. And in 1947, the 10 Points of Salisbury, crafted by Jules Isaac and Jewish and ecumenical Christian leaders, challenged Christian teachings of contempt and called for a change in Christian education. So these two documents set the stage for Nostra Aetate, the Catholic Church's post-Holocaust document of reconciliation. The scope and authority of the Catholic Church gave Nostra Aetate unmatched influence. Vatican II's global reach allowed its message to ripple far and wide, shaping Catholic education, theology, and relations with Jews and other faiths across the world. The inclusion of Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism in the fall 1964 drafts not only enabled the Jewish Declaration to pass, but it was a transformative step. The new template drew in much of the religious world then as it does today. And its tone set the tone for future interfaith work and raised the bar for pluralism. It was ahead of its time. Each pioneering document is in conversation with those that came before and opens a conversation with those that follow. Nostra Aetate and the many Catholic and Protestant documents of Jewish-Christian relations that succeeded it inspired the pioneering Dabru Emet, a Jewish statement on Christians and Christianity in the year 2000, and informed the Muslim 2004 Amman Message and 2007 A Common Word. Nostra Aetate demonstrated the power of authoritative religious declarations to provide theological clarity and counter distorted and dangerous narratives. From the opening of Vatican II in 1962 to the final vote in 1965, it was never certain that the Church would take this historic about-face on its theological understanding of Judaism and the Jewish people. As you heard, opposition came from conservative theologians, bishops in Arab countries, and even some American Jews who were wary of church narratives. But Pope John XXIII's vision, Cardinal Augustin Bea's leadership, and Pope Paul VI's moral courage helped steer the process through resistance. Nostra Aetate is a post-Holocaust document of reconciliation. It could not erase the past, but it could lay a new theological foundation. Like Jacob wrestling with an angel before reconciling with Esau, the Church wrestled with its history, and it emerged changed. The Church was ready to employ a new hermeneutic of reform. Now, while the Council focused on Catholic self-understanding, Jewish thinkers like Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel engaged deeply with the process, offering both support and critique, leading them to craft their own influential 1965 treatises, respectively opposing and supporting interfaith dialogue. For Jews, Nostra Aetate promised a level of safety and recognition unprecedented in Christian history. Yet theological change requires more than words. The most esteemed Jewish medieval scholar, Maimonides, taught that repentance means acknowledging wrongdoing, taking corrective action, and ensuring the sin, in this case, the sin of anti-Semitism, is not repeated. Nostra Aetate was a powerful step in that direction. It was not an end, but a beginning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So my intention is to pose a few questions to my colleagues here and then open the floor for those of you who might also have questions. And we've heard a bit, maybe you need to repeat the details, Jonathan, about the historical beginnings, and very importantly, we've heard some of the shortcomings, and we've heard also a kind of resonance back toward that very important period of the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, and how we get from Origen, who it's us Jews and Christians against you pagans, to a perspective where it's us Christians and it's you Jews and pagans. And we've heard how this magnificent step forward is the beginning, certainly not the end, of progress. So one of my questions has to do with context, because yes, the Holocaust isn't mentioned, and on the other hand, rather interestingly, of course, as you may recall, the trial of Eichmann, a very, very public trial of Eichmann, had taken place the year and a half before, bringing the Holocaust into everybody's living rooms by radio and this newfangled device called television across America and Europe. So what kind of an impact did the Holocaust have, even though it's 15, 17 years later, on the decision, the idea of promulgating this document?
Let me just say briefly,
John.
yes, the arrest and trial of Eichmann took place during the preparatory phase of Vatican II. And I think one of the reasons Ben-Gurion wanted to televise it was not only to show the world, but to get the survivors talking. The silence was deafening. Roel Hilberg, who tried to publish his initial study of the Holocaust, couldn't find a publisher. It's too terrible, we can't publish this. And when he did, began to catch on. But I think it was the Eichmann trial that loosened the tongue. Deborah Leipzig agrees with me on this, that changed things. So one reason for, I think, the absence of the Shoah, it was the silence leading up to Vatican II. And then where do you begin? So many of the drafters of various parts of the text say, we wanted to mention this, but where do you begin and how many words would we need to put that in? So Bea had said it, it's a public document, it's on the record. When he presented the text in '63, he went over and admitted how many Christians were infected by Nazism and participated in the Holocaust. But I think they couldn't have said more. And think about it though, it wasn't until 1987 when Pope John Paul II was coming here. First stop was Florida, meeting with Jewish leaders. And Jewish leaders wanted to go over and talk to him about, well, during the summer, you hosted the former Waldheim, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, who turned out to have been part of an SS unit. And this led to some serious discussions, and Cardinal Willebrand, who by then was running the whole operation, Bea had died, and Cardinal Willebrand was made a cardinal and ran the secretariat and was president of the Commission for Religious Relations. He said, I think it's about time our commission addressed the Shoah. So that's how long it took.
So I'll add to that. What's interesting is, and I took a shot and said, no Holocaust in the document. It's not quite clear what one would have said, and the evidence of that, John is mentioning this later history. In 1998, when the document we remember was released, most people would think that didn't bring a whole lot more clarity to it either. And it's fundamentally a very difficult question. That is there an apology? Is there a historical reckoning? It's hard to know what that would look like. And so, even when John Paul went to the Western Wall in 2000 and had that document that he inserted, very powerful scene, his language about Jewish suffering, it's very theologically complex for a 10-line document. It's basically like a card, because it's a really hard question to answer. That is, how is it relevant? What is Christianity, if at all, implicated? What about individual Christians? And so I'm more sympathetic to the absence of that, perhaps, than I suggested at the start. It's not easy. Yeah.
Okay. Why I say it is a document of reconciliation, a post-Holocaust document. Clearly, the Eichmann trials were happening as the document was at its beginning phase. Number two, the document is foundational The foundation of it is by Jules Isaac. He wrote his book, Jesus and Israel, while in hiding from the Nazis. He's lost his high post. He got the New Testament in Greek and all sorts of resources from colleagues as he hid. During that time, he was out at the barber, and his wife and daughter-in-law and son were taken. They would all die, his wife and daughter-in-law in Auschwitz and his son in Bergen-Belsen. And he wrote this book, and he came up with 21 propositions of why Christianity had become distorted in its messages, and how at its core it was very connected to Judaism. And of his 21 propositions came these 18 teachings for rectifying the rectification necessary in Christian teaching, 18 points. And from that, he would create the 10 points of Salisbury. And so that was the document, as Dr. Borelli said 10 years ago, that if you took the 10 points of Salisbury and posed them all as questions, Nostra Aetate would answer 9.5 of them. So it really was a document based on the 10 points of Salisbury that Jules Isaac created out of his suffering. And he said this document was born of persecution. He wrote in the dedication, "In memoriam to my wife and my daughter, martyrs killed by Hitler's Nazis," actually it was his wife and daughter and son-in-law, "martyrs killed by Nazis, killed simply because their name was Isaac." I think it's also important to know that Gregory Baum, the first member to join the subcommittee addressing the Jewish Declaration, he was born of a Jewish mother and Protestant father. He didn't know his Jewish identity, but became aware of it when he was impacted by the Nuremberg laws. He escaped on a kinder transport and ultimately converted or became a priest. Johannes Osterreicher, he was raised as a Jew in Moravia. He was active in Zionist scouting in high school, and at the age of 20, he fell in love with Christ. He worked to combat the Nazis on radio and in print, and his thesis was the Nazis would have attacked Catholics and Protestants in the same manner they attacked Jews. So 2 authors lost family members in the Holocaust. And I think lastly, as the time they were writing in 1963, there was a play called The Deputy that was on stage worldwide, which showed the guilt of Pope Pius XII. It was really based on a lot of documents.
So that was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
Was Pius XII in people's heads at the point when this was starting to take place?
What's so important is Cardinal Bea was the priest confessor of Pope Pius XII. And so you could really ask yourself, how much did he know? How much did he hear? What did Pope Pius XII confess to him that moved Cardinal Bea to be such a strong and passionate and steadfast steward of this document?
This leads me to another question.
Let me just...
Oh, please, go ahead.
When I worked with Father Thomas Stransky, he used to joke about, I can't remember what I had for lunch, but I can tell you when the Deputy premiered in Berlin, it did enter into the discussion. Some of the Deputy was really creative, to be kind, or abusive, and some wrote terrible reviews about it. It was heard of, but I don't think that had as much impact. What was this Bishop Stangl of Würzburg, who was on the Secretariat for Christian Unity, said, we're only beginning to face this. We're really coming to terms with what really happened in as much shock as we are. And we have to move forward, so we need this document. But I think everybody knew that much had to be done in the investigation of these matters. And this required dialogue and conversation, which Nostra Aetate called for, but preceded. It wasn't a dialogue text, it was a constitution for dialogue. And so some critics would say to Stransky, bishop critics, he said, how can you prove this on Scripture? Give us time, we will. Let the Scripture scholars work on this. We're confident this is the direction we should go. So.
I do have a question. It's not often that I get a colleague who's a specialist in the early church. So there is that dramatic change between Origen, who it's us Jews and Christians against you pagans in his Contra Celsum, and then a century later, we have a much angrier anti-Jewish rhetoric from church leaders. Do you have a sense of what causes that change, other than just the evolution of competition and what have you?
Well, there is a really interesting episode, and it seems crazy. It was crazy, but it's one of those. It's kind of like crazy things we're seeing now that tipped people in a certain direction. You will remember that the Emperor Julian, in order to aggravate the Christians whom he had gladly left, proposed, and who knows whether he was serious or not, the rebuilding of the temple on the Temple Mount. And this sent people in the East, around a bend, because they had just witnessed, maybe not with complete lack of ambivalence, they had just witnessed the creation of a Christian Jerusalem. And this would topographically, geographically, and in terms of worship, overturn their entire expectation.
And then Julian is killed by friendly fire.
Sorry?
Julian is then killed by friendly fire,
yes.
which is taken to be the hand of God punishing him.
Well, yes. I mean, you can read some pretty awful Christian sermons on exactly this point.
Yeah.
But Boyarin really likes Jesus in the Gospel of Mark for its apocalyptic aspects. Isn't that right? Whereas others look at the Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew and have great argument with him. And so he sees that much of what Jesus is as Son of Man, coming from Daniel and so forth, is understandable and appreciative. And so it seems like there were whole communities of these Christians, maybe Johannine communities, I don't know, that were keeping alive their Jewish practices. Isn't that true? For a couple of centuries?
Oh, yes, it is true. I mean, it wasn't until Justinian got his men out into the countryside, cleaning things up, that we begin to see a really definitive separation where people can't cross lines.
Mm-hmm.
I have two more related questions before opening things up to our audience. The related questions are this. What sort of an impact do you suppose the document had differently from perhaps where it started out, with the inclusion of a whole range of other faith traditions and not just the Jews? And related to that is, and if you read the document, the Jews come last in the discussion. It's a longer discussion, and I won't give you my opinion of how equivocal or unequivocal it is relative to the statements on Islam, the Dharmic traditions, and so on. What are your thoughts about that, about the multiplying it out of just a Catholic-Jewish relationship? Any of you first?
I'm happy to start. It wasn't till the third session in 1964 that came about, and it actually was introduced by the Coordinating Commission. And that was the most alarming time when the document became more conservative, so much so that there were Jews saying it was the worst moment of the year. Rabbis were saying in their high holiday sermons, the worst moment of this past year was the AJC's interaction with Vatican II, because there was so much fear about the potential impact of this conservative statement. But it did include the Muslims in this, right? Catholic relations with Muslims. And that was really fortuitous turn in the story, I believe. So in November 20th, 1964, when it sort of swings back to a more moderate statement, Cardinal Bea presented it to the Vatican at that point, and he said, he observed that you could apply this declaration, you could apply to the declaration the biblical comparison of the grain of a mustard seed. It was first intended as a brief declaration on the church and the Jewish people. But in the course of time, this little seed had become almost a tree in which many birds were finding nests. That was to say, in which all non-Christian religions were finding their proper place. Bea concluded his statement saying, for the first time in conciliar history, principles dealing with non-Christians were set forth in solemn form. The church had a serious obligation to initiate dialogue with the 1 billion men who knew not Christ or his work of redemption. It was the task of the church to help them obtain a full share of the riches of Christ. So the inclusion, I believe, of Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism enabled the Jewish Declaration to pass with that strong vote that it received. Right after that, a Judith Hirschkopf-Benke, who worked for the AJC, she said it was able to pass because it was really an omnibus declaration that included so much. But I think that it laid the foundation for progress in interreligious relations, education, and dialogue. It inspired so many other faith movements to theologically and educationally self-reckon. And while it emerged from conservative ranks, it was transformative. The template that was created drew in much of the religious world then, as it does today. It set the tone for this interfaith work that would follow. It raised the bar on pluralism and interfaith declarations of dialogue in addressing multiple faiths. It was, as I said, ahead of its time.
Thank you. Other thought? Okay.
Did you go ahead?
I wanted to add to that. Thank you. That I did go back to the older translations of the documents of Vatican II, and there's a fascinating footnote which I think is really important, and it sort of goes along with why I wanted to mention Mort Shimoni, and that is that Jules Isaac had a private audience with Pius XII in 1949 and pressed him to alter the Good Friday prayers.
Right.
On the same day that the decree, that is Nostra Aetate, was promulgated, the Congregation of Rights, surely a conservative group, not easily inclined to change, they issued a decree banning the further veneration of Simon of Trent. Yes, you haven't heard of him. He was the Christian boy said to have been murdered by Jews in 1475 to obtain blood for celebrating Pascha. And I think this alteration at the popular level, where people who once went to the Triduum would hear the condemnation of the imprecation it's against the Jews, no longer hear it, and it begins to match up with their life experience. And it seems to me that this reaches a very wide group of people, and just how shocking it is, just what a beneficial change it was. You can register if you go to a Good Friday church in a congregation, not a Catholic congregation, at least not if they're legal, that repeats those imprecations, which are very ancient indeed.
Yeah, that's true. What you're saying is true, too. It was after Seelisberg. So Isaac went to Rome. He had what they call a bacia mano, a kiss the hand, a short meet with Pius XII, and he gave him that report. But he never felt like anything came of this. I think he included those 10 points with his folder that he brought to John the 23rd, which when Stransky got his assignment, he opened the file, and that's what he was looking at, what Jules Isaac brought. So 1964 was a critical year, and it's when Bea lost control of the document for a few months. So the Secretariat met, and they tried a paragraph in March on Muslims. The two drafters actually drafted it in Arabic and then put it into Latin so that it would be understandable to everybody. But then the Secretariat did not get a three-quarter vote to include it, so it was removed. They had one general sentence in there about all religions. But then it went to the coordinating committee, and if you look at the minutes, the secretary of the coordinating committee at one point said, look at all these drafts. We had about 8 drafts floating around. Paul VI was involved in this. All kinds of things were going on. And what came out was a kind of Frankenstein, moving lines around an altered text that line about reconciliation, Zephaniah, came right after the invitation to dialogue. Oh, you want a dialogue to convert us? I mean, that's one of the things Heschel was upset about. And then it was presented, and the Secretariat said, this isn't our text. Well, I know, Bea said, but I lost control of it. But even though the bishops were loud and clear, expand the document, and Bea then said no to any other interference, retained it. They wanted to split it up in many texts, retained it, and Cardinal Koenig of Austria, Vienna, got involved. And I've never been able to figure out who asked him, but he called together the experts on Hinduism and Buddhism, Yves Congar, one of the great minds of Vatican II, and Molaire, Father Charles Molaire, who that whole first part comes from him about the questions. He taught religion and culture. And they put together the expanded text with the Jewish drafting committee, with a separate Muslim drafting committee. The language changes to Muslims, not Islam, in paragraph 3, and to Jews, relations with Jews. It's interesting. And when Bea saw that, he didn't think he had a mandate to have a paragraph on Islam. But when he saw it, he said, this is pretty good. It hangs together really well. So it went through quite a process there. But
Can I just, if I could just rather briefly just note, on the one hand, the inclusion of other religions, it feels as if the original Jewish focus gets superficially maybe sidelined. On the other hand, it's quite a lovely and thoughtful document. I mean, the ways in which it speaks about other religions lays the foundation for other reflection on Islam and Eastern religions over time. And so there are really some great foundations to that document. What I think is especially important for those who are interested in paragraph 4, section 4, and Jewish-Christian relations is that while it gives the appearance, I think, of sort of sidelining that issue, one of the things that I think is especially heartening is the way in which, at least in practice, and in the wake of that document, it has not been sidelined.
No.
And so on paper, it may look a little bit like that because it got changed, but it really has not deflected the Church's sort of deep commitment that's been made institutionally, theologically, intellectually to those issues.
Have we run out of time, timekeeper? So we have.
Can we take one quick
Can we
question?
take, you can't argue with Borelli, can you? Could we have one question from the audience? It better be a good one.
Just one thing. Stransky called it, part 4, the jewel. The rest was the setting. Maybe.
Because
I
you
agree,
can say-
like creation, it was the ultimate moment, right? Like man, then woman of the 6 days of creation, I think.
So, well, then we can save questions. The next, of course, session is going to take us present, future, coming from past. And by then, maybe you'll be emboldened to have more questions afterwards. But meanwhile, join me in thanking these brilliant people for having.
Thank you. Great line. Oh, wow. Good.